All right, it's great to see some of you again and again. And here we are on our sixth session. And welcome today to session 6, which is Colorado
Buenos días.
Data Story. How do we gather and share stories?
Bienvenidos a nuestra sección de hoy, que es cómo recogemos y compartimos datos y historias.
We are offering simultaneous English and Spanish interpretation for today's session. In a moment, you will see the option to choose the language you would like to listen in and participate in today. This will show up as a small globe or / network within your Zoom controls at the bottom of your screen. And then you will select English or Spanish. Now I'd like to introduce our colleague, Lucia, from the Colorado Language Connection to explain more about how this works in Spanish. Lucia.
Ok. Hola, buenos días. Para la junta de hoy, la reunión de hoy, si quieres escuchar esto en español, hay una tecla abajo de la página donde puedes escoger español si es que necesita traducción hoy, y así escucharás mi voz interpretando lo que se está hablando en español, y puedes escoger ahí abajo.
Okay, thank you. We're enabling that function right now. You'll see it at the bottom of your screen. And again, we're recording this session both in English and in Spanish. And if you have colleagues that would like to participate in our last session and need additional languages, please let us know and we'll do our best to accommodate. And also, please let your colleagues know that the recordings are available in Spanish as well. All right, we can go to the next slide. Once again, our team would like to welcome you. On the call today is our managing partner, Rochelle Espiritu, myself, Scott Van Loo, project director, and Alina Taniuchi, our project manager. And we want to just recognize Eve Kucharski, who contributed a lot of material for today's session, but is not with us today. And once again, thank you for being here with us. Just a quick reminder for our Zoom and group agreements. We welcome you to stay on camera. In fact, we love it when you stay on camera. We love to see your faces and interact with you. Otherwise, if you're unable to do so today, please put an asterisk by your name so the presenters will know you will be listening only today. Please be an active participant in the session. We want to hear and read your thoughts and ideas. Again, live simultaneous English and Spanish interpretation is available. And once again, the session will be recorded and posted online. Please send a private message to Alina if you would prefer that your verbal or chat responses not be recorded. So our agenda for today and our outcomes are to understand how the brain responds differently to stories and data. We're going to integrate ethical and equity considerations in storytelling. We want to amplify the lived experiences of diverse community members and identify the structure of a story and give you time to practice that structure in small groups. And then finally, we just have one more session after today, and that will be on March 22nd. And it'll be how do we bring together the data, stories, and visualizations in a clear, compelling, and equitable manner. So we hope to synthesize all the different sessions that we've been working on with you and show you how we might be able to apply that in your context. Welcome, Nicole. All right, so our community builder for this morning is, if you would, please share a story that really impacted you, thinking back. It can be in your early life, your formative years, or recently. And then just think about the elements of that story. What made it a good story? And what did you connect with in that story? Okay, so share a story that really impacted you. What made it a good story and what did you connect with? And if you would please unmute and share, or if you'd like to, or rather you can put it in the chat. But you know how we love to hear from you. I can get us started here. I'm thinking back, I think I've shared before, I used to live in Summit County in Dillon, and we had a lot of parents that were coming into our school from Central America and South America. And they were coming up into the mountain communities to work in the ski resorts because there's a lot of jobs up there. But as you can imagine, very difficult. And we decided, we got a little small grant at our school. And so we decided to interview families similar to this storytelling piece just to find out more about them. And we were having difficulty like getting our students records from their old schools. And so we decided to do this interview process to find out, what was their schooling like and what was their home like. And I think there were several stories that impacted me because of the realism of the journey that they got to get here. I mean, some of our families, it took them 2 or 3 months. They took trains across Mexico. They got stopped at the border and separated, and then reunited as they were claiming asylum, and then made that journey from the border all the way up to the mountains of Colorado. So I think I've heard kind of some of these things, like on the news and all that, but to hear it like right here in front of your face, it really made a big impact on me. And I think what stuck for me is just the idea of that journey and trying to put myself literally in their shoes. Like, what would that be like to just leave everything and walk and catch trains and cross borders and get separated and then land in the middle of a resort community. And then the emotion that I felt too really made the impact for me, and then ultimately made me want to do more to help the families integrate into our school. All right, anybody else?
Scott, I'm going to go back to more of a childhood story. So when I was probably 8 or 9 years old when the first Star Wars movie came out, and it was, I remember it for several reasons. One, it was my dad took me and a whole bunch of kids, like I think there were 9 or 10 of us that went into the movie theater and watched Star Wars. And I remember watching the storyline and being really impressed by Princess Leia as a young girl, and just the story of her bravery and her sassiness and like her drive to do good was what I kind of connected with as a young girl, and I loved her hair. And so they're just things that I think really stuck with me as a young kid at that age, watching a movie with a powerful princess in the movie. So that was memorable for me. And I saw Jessie clap her hands, so I think you connected too. Anyone else like to share a story? It could be a childhood story or a story you've heard recently.
I was starting to type it, so instead I'll switch to talking it. So this is my first time on one of these sessions. So real quick, my name is Jessie Bustamante. I'm the Director of Communications at Food to Power. We're a Colorado Springs-based grassroots food justice nonprofit. And one of the programs that we run is called No Cost Grocery, where we redistribute food out to the community at no cost, obviously. And I'm thinking about this story that I've heard from one of the participants, or like of one of the participants, I should say, where she was a recent immigrant, and I don't remember which country she was originally from, unfortunately, but she didn't know anyone when she came here. She was just hoping to build a better life and wanted to like get any resources that she might need in that quest, right? And so she came to our grocery, and she came routinely and got to know the volunteers and the community members and made connections that way. And now she's doing really well, and she comes back and she brings us tamales every so often because she just loves seeing her people here. So not to the same stint, but I moved to Colorado in 2018 and didn't know anyone here except for, at the time, my long distance boyfriend. And so like that element of like going somewhere that was strange and unknown and trying to build a new life made it especially impactful. And I'm just really proud that we were able to be part of building a new community for her. So.
Thanks for sharing, Jessie.
We also have one in the chat from Mia. Hi, Mia. And she's saying the first time I saw Dr. Anthony Eaton present life expectancy data by using the Metro map in Washington, D.C. And each Metro line had a different life expectancy. So it sounds like the combination of the presenter and the visual and then the information was really impactful. All right, anybody else? We have time. A couple minutes if you want to share.
It's not so much a story, but I had a professor that was a professional storyteller, and she talked to us about how, like, the different parts of a story to make it compelling and impactful and to resonate with other people, and to use like different, you know, tones or imagery to elicit like feelings and emotions. And that always kind of stuck with me, because when you go to like create a persuasive argument, you know, it's important to tell your story in a way that will appeal to your audience. So I just thought that was interesting.
Very interesting. Thank you, Maria. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of that at the end of the presentation today, like those elements that make a good story. So I'd love it if you bring that back into the conversation. Okay, well, what I heard about the commonalities were just that there was something that connected to you personally, that there was maybe an emotional component that also created a deep response or deeper response, and that somehow maybe there was something in the story that motivated you or changed your perspective. So thank you all for sharing.
Thanks for kicking us off, Scott. And Maria, that was a great segue into our next couple of slides. So first, I want to share this quote from Maya Angelou, that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And so this for us kind of goes to some of the science behind storytelling and why it's so important. We know that stories have been part of our life. I mean, when you think back to stories that were found in caves, that has been a part of the way that our society has communicated with people for thousands of years. And they play such a vibrant part of our life in many cultures as well. The stories are passed down from generation to generation, and this is how we kind of create our, for many societies, are just our common knowledge and customs and ways. And so it's a very powerful way to engage with people and to share information. So that's kind of the basis for this whole series. We've been focusing a lot on data for the first few set of sessions that we've had, looking at both quantitative data and qualitative data. And now we're going to move in a little bit to the narrative, to how to tell the story, how to gather your stories. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about the visuals. We'll bring that into the mix at the next session. And so there's several reasons why we want to make sure that we're thinking about our data and the story that it can tell. And that is because there's a whole science behind storytelling. And Maria, this gets to what you were talking about earlier here. Our brain reacts to stories. So I think back to that time when I was watching the Star Wars movie. And there are a ton of intense moments in that movie. And during that time, that is when the hormone cortisol is released, because it helps us really focus on the story and know what is going on. During those times when something good is happening, our brain releases these feel-good chemicals like oxytocin. Sorry, I'm not the biologist or scientist. And that really promotes empathy, empathy for the characters or for what's happening in the story itself. And then happy endings tend to stimulate the brain, and that's when dopamine can be released. And that kind of gives us that feeling of hope or satisfaction when we see happy events going on. So there's all kinds of things happening in our brain when we're listening to stories or watching stories, and it helps us engage in quite a different way, rather than seeing data or numbers or hearing about numbers. And so when you put that all together, this is kind of, again, a preview to session 4. When you have a story or a narrative that is coupled with data in the blue box, it helps to kind of explain to your audience what's happening with that data, what insights you might need to help explain something to your audience. And so that gives your audience a lot of context to appreciate what's happening in that data. And then when you put the visuals onto the data, it helps to enlighten them in the sense that they might be able to see things in the data that you wouldn't normally be able to without having maybe some charts or some graphs or something that gives a visual to a lot of numbers, which can be sometimes confusing. So those visuals can help you see patterns in the data that you wouldn't normally see with just a list. And so then finally, when you put the visuals and the narrative together, it kind of helps you to engage. It can help you engage the audience by having them see a little bit more about what you're trying to say with your visual. And when you put those all together, I love this visual even, because then you can kind of see in the center that's when you can really help to impact some change. When everyone can see the data, when they can feel the data, when they can make sense of the data, that can get you to making some powerful movement happen. So that's partly why we're doing this entire series here. So I'm going to pass it over to Alina now, and she's going to talk a little bit around the ethical and equity considerations to think about when we're telling or gathering stories in community.
Thanks, Rochelle. I think actually Scott put a lot of this together and he's still able to join us for the next few minutes. So I think he's going to go over these.
Oh, okay, great.
Sorry.
So first of all, I just want to say this was taken from a website called Voice of Witness, and we're using this with permission from them. We have the link in the next slide, so if you're interested in learning more about this, that's really good material. So that particular organization, their whole mission is to amplify voices of injustice, or people who experience oppression or injustice. And so they came up with these considerations. So the first one, to invest in relationships to build trust, mutual respect, and collaboration. So as you can imagine, the story that I shared earlier from when I was in Summit County, we decided to use one of our teachers who is originally from Mexico and first language Spanish speaker to interview our families. And so we used that as a bridge, and we used a private location within the school. We provided some comforts like coffee and tea and snacks, and really gave her a chance to build that trust and mutual respect before asking them some of these really intimate and vulnerable kinds of questions. And then ultimately, those relationships stayed over a long period of time. So we didn't just take the stories to use them, but we gathered the stories in order to make change within our systems. But then also what came out of all of that was this need to have a long-term relationship with our families, which we did. And ultimately we ended up having specific events where we invited the families in. So it started with these interviews, and then it led to like potlucks and shared events and getting them connected to each other and to other community resources. So it was a different kind of intention where we really focused on building that long-term mutual respect, collaboration, and trust. And then the second one says to prioritize ongoing informed consent and transparency through the process. So, of course, again, in my story, these are a group of individuals and parents and families who are very vulnerable, and they've been hurt in tremendous ways in their own countries, and of course, through that process of immigrating here to the US. And so they're already maybe less trusting than many of our other families in the school. And so this is really important that we have this transparency. Why are we doing this? Is it okay that we're constantly checking in with how we're gathering the story? And then ultimately, if we're going to share any of that information, how are we going to share it? And that they're a partner in that, and that they have control of every part of that process, which is number 3. They own that story, and they have control over where and how it's shared. And then, as I mentioned, when we got our families together, they started sharing some of their own stories in a healing context. So ultimately, they got to kind of practice telling that story in a controlled space with us. And then when they were in a community, they were able to share them with each other, and it became more of a healing and connecting context, as many of them had the same or similar kinds of stories of getting to this place in the mountains. Number 4 says to honor authenticity, complexity, and the whole person rather than approaching preconceived expectations or framing narrators as victims or heroes. So that's a really complex process or thought process, but that we always have to be careful as we're gathering the story or we're encouraging the story, that we don't put our own bias in there, right? Or that we don't quickly conclude like, oh, in this particular context, I see you as a hero, right? So that we're not supposing or putting our own context into what their story means to them or is really to them, and allow them to say and use their own words to frame what that story is, and hopefully, ideally, let the story speak for itself. And number 5 says be prepared to use a trauma-informed approach. So if we're getting into these stories, they can be really intense, and listening to stories, we can experience what's called vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. And we need to be prepared, if we're the ones that are doing the interviewing or gathering the stories, for everything from, there might be tears, or there might be other emotions shared, anger, frustration, despair, and that we need to be prepared and in this trauma-informed lens on how to sit in that space. Okay. And then number 6 says to position narrators as the experts. So I often say, like, your story is just as important as any context or text. It can become the text for our understanding, okay? The story can become the text for our understanding if we position that person as an expert, because they've had a lived experience that no one else has had in the way that they've had it, and therefore we need to elevate it as an expert. Yeah, thank you, Jesse. Yeah, very true. Number 7, acknowledge and mitigate power dynamics and biases. So the easiest way to do that is to get in touch with our own story and to understand even how that interaction of interviewer, interviewee, or if you're doing focus groups, understand your own presence, your own bias, your own power dynamic, and then some of those biases that we covered in the last session, if you remember, or the last couple of sessions where, sometimes people have like people being interviewed have a bias to say what they think you want to hear, right? So understanding all of that bigger context, and again, trying to create a relationship-based approach where you can get the root of that story. And it might take several times. Like you might gather a story over several interactions. And then finally, ensure stories are accessible to the narrator communities. So so that there's not this notion that we're just coming in and taking something from a person or from the community that they represent, but that there's a distributive and generative power to their story, so that it can go back into the community ultimately to have some kind of actionable or articulated effect, that their story just isn't for us or our use of it, but that it comes back and it's used in some way. So before we move on, I just want to see, is there anything else, any reactions or anything else you would add to this idea of ethical and equitable considerations in storytelling? I'm just curious, have any of you already gone through a storytelling gathering process? Like you've done interviews with any of your community members or end users of services, or have you done focus groups? If not, it's okay. All right, good. Well, we'll keep moving and then we'll fold this into some of your small group time.
Thanks, Scott. So I'm gonna just preview this video quickly, and then Alina's gonna share her screen. So this brought us back a few decades here. Our colleague Eve shared this particular video with us and thought that it would be a really interesting way to share some ideas around some best practices and what not to do when you're thinking about interviewing people, and a way for really us to highlight some different kinds of strategies. So I'm going to stop my screen share for now, and Alina's going to share her screen, and we're just going to watch the first few minutes of this video, and just want you to kind of pay attention and maybe jot down your own notes around what's going well, what's not going well in this interview that Barbara Walters is conducting. Thanks, Alina.
I'm going to react to an old Dolly Parton interview that's gaining a lot of attention lately. My older brother recommended this one actually, and he was one of my first subscribers almost 6 years ago, and he is still watching. So this one's for you. So we're going to look at how Barbara Walters and Dolly Parton handle themselves here. And I welcome you to offer your own comments in that section below. I'll put a link to the original video that I'm watching from that channel. And thank you, Happy Mag, for reposting this. For some background, this interview happened in 1977. Dolly was around 31 years old, and Walters was 16 years older than her, I believe about 47 at the time. So by then, both Walters and Dolly were already known public figures. Dolly had huge hits already like Jolene and I Will Always Love You. She was on a popular TV show for years. Walters was an established and respected TV journalist. She was interviewing people like Fidel Castro and other high-profile figures. From an educational standpoint, it's true that you and I won't be in high-level interviews like this, but we will find ourselves in difficult conversations, job interviews, and handling questions and answers after presentations. This conversation has a lot of lessons to learn about what to do and what not to do. So we'll take this one chunk at a time.
Dolly, where I come from, would I have called you a hillbilly?
If you had of, it would have been something very natural, but I would have probably kicked your shins or something. No, actually.
But when I think of hillbillies, am I thinking of your kind of people?
I think you probably are. The people that grew up where I was were the ones that you would consider the little Abner people, Daisy Mae and that sort of thing. They took that kind of thing from people like us, but we were very proud people. People with a lot of class. It was country class, but it was a great deal of class. And most of my people were not that educated, but they are very, very intelligent. Good common sense, horse sense, we called it.
First, Barbara Walters' questions here are already fairly insulting. She's deliberately communicating in an us versus them mindset. She says, where I'm from, would I have called you a hillbilly?
Dolly, where I come from, would I have called you a hillbilly?
She contrasts where I'm from with your kind of people and even points at herself and then points at Dolly. The word hillbilly is considered an insult, but I love how Dolly playfully says that had Walters said that, she probably would have kicked her shins. But Walters just looks at her with a stone face and interrupts Dolly as she's trying to answer and asks her again.
But when I think of hillbillies, am I thinking of your kind of people?
I think
We're one segment in here and she's already said hillbilly twice. Walters is trying to use a soft tone of voice as she asks her questions, but I don't see the benefit of these questions in the first place. She's not showing any goodwill. She's not trying to establish any common ground. Her questions seem designed to antagonize Dolly. But the big news here is how Dolly answers. She takes the high road. She stays composed, stays 100% positive. She describes the people in her hometown community as proud people, people with a lot of class.
most of my people were not that educated, but they are very, very intelligent.
She's polite, respectful. And if you only heard Dolly's response, her side of the conversation, you'd never know that Walter's question was a cheap shot. You can see the different approaches here in the conversation already very clearly. Check plus for Dolly Parton, check minus for Walters.
Dolly, did you look like this when you were a kid?
Not quite.
I mean, you didn't have the blonde wig, but when you went into school, when you were 11, 12, 13, was it this about you?
Well, you mean the full figure?
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah, I thought that's what you meant. Well, actually, I've always been pretty well blessed. As a child, I grew up fast. Other members of my family, have done the same.
My assistant asked me something, and I'm going to blame it on her because I wouldn't have had the nerve otherwise. Is it all you?
Well, I can't show you here right on television.
I'll take your word for it.
I get asked that question. I always answer that because people are in awe of the whole thing. A lot of people say I have. A lot of people say I haven't. I always say that if I hadn't have had it on my own, I'm just the kind of person that would have had me some maid.
You can see Walters give Dolly the elevator eyes for these questions. She looks her up and down and she asks if Dolly looked like this growing up. She points at Dolly's body and she asks, is this all you? Walters literally blames her assistant for this question.
My assistant asked me something, and I'm going to blame it on her because I wouldn't have had the nerve otherwise.
This is an old version of a journalism trick. I'm not asking. People are asking. I'm just reporting. But look, Dolly's been asked this question many times before about her full figure, as she puts it. This is familiar conversational territory, and she handles this personal and potentially rude comment with charm and class. She was obviously more comfortable talking about it than Walters was. Again, check plus for Dolly, check minus for Walters for asking very stereotypical questions.
You don't have...
All right. So that brought us back several decades here. What were your thoughts or reflections when you watched that video?
My face was going on a journey at Barbara just being so rude. That's the bottom line. I'm just like, ma'am, no, your kind of people, no.
Yeah, Jesse, it's interesting to think back to Barbara being that young, or, the start of her career and the way in which she approached that interview. Oh, Nicole, we can see you talking, but we can't hear you. The chord's not in the
Can you hear me now?
yes.
Yay. Okay. So, I love Dolly. I always have. I think she's like super classy. Even, we all know she had a rough background growing up and whatnot, but I find it interesting that she didn't let that keep her down. And even in this video, people look up to Barbara Walters and think she's refined and whatnot, but really, I saw it to be the other way. I felt like Dolly was more refined and more classy than Barbara even thought to be. So yeah, that's where I'm at. But yeah, just because you're a journalist does not excuse your behavior.
True. And I appreciated this storyteller professor kind of doing the check plus and check minus and if you want to watch the rest of it, she gets Barbara Walters gets the check minuses all the way through the interview, which I think is, it's just needing to think kind of really critically about what's the purpose of the questions that we are asking, and how do they come across. Questions can be very powerful, and when we think about the questions that we're asking in focus groups or in interviews, there's a power to the question that we need to consider. And so that was really the purpose of sharing this particular video with you. So I will go ahead and share my screen again and pass it over to Alina to talk a little bit more about interviewing strategies.
Thanks, Rochelle, and thanks everyone for sticking through the interview. I think that was something that stood out to me, was that I think if in this day and age, I feel like a lot of people would have just kind of gotten up and walked away from that interview if someone were to come, if an interviewer were to come so kind of blatantly rudely at an interviewee. And, all props to Dolly for sticking it out and answering with such class, as you said. But I think that's something we need to be very mindful of and careful of as we go into community, and as we ask people to share their stories, as we ask people to give us insights into their lives. It's something to come at with kind of an eye towards being humble, and really trying to learn about what they have to share, rather than putting your own preconceived notions necessarily on that person. So these are some tips that we have around doing the going through an interview process as you start to develop a story. You may not be the one that's particularly conducting an interview of someone or gathering their story, but you might be leading the efforts, and you want to talk to those who you're working with to make sure that your approach is being done in a way that will be welcoming to communities and building that trust over time, as Scott talked about in his section around how those relationships can really be long lasting and can be really fruitful over time. But it does take work, and it does take time, and it takes respect as well. So these are some considerations from the perspective of an interviewee as you ask questions. It's easy to default to one's own cultural background and the understanding of a person's situation. When you craft your questions ahead of time, you want to do so with a sense of cultural humility, an attempt to gauge the reaction an interviewee might have to the questions. And don't be afraid to reframe or pivot if you accidentally overstep boundaries. If you see someone, and if you're doing it in person or you have a video conference, you can kind of see them in their body language too, and how they're reacting, how they're maybe feeling in a space, and be mindful of that, and try and be very intentional about how you are showing up in that interview. If you come with a list of questions, but your interviewee maybe goes off on a tangent, and that they're maybe answering questions that are farther down on your list, don't be afraid to go with their lead and follow kind of where they want to share their story. Because it could be that you learn more insights that you weren't necessarily ready to or weren't necessarily expecting to, but it may be more true to their story. And it'll allow the interviewee to feel more comfortable in sharing their story, and really give you some deeper answers that you might not have been expecting. Sometimes before you really have a relationship or rapport with the interviewee, the answer to your questions might be short or lacking in depth. This is kind of basic, but I think we've often talked about, don't ask yes or no questions because it doesn't necessarily allow for a person to open up and really give you some insights. It just kind of enables them to brush it off and then move on. So if an interview is going well, don't hesitate to bring up a question that got a short answer before, maybe got a yes or no when you weren't necessarily framing it in that way. And you might be able to get some more insights after you've built some more relationship there with that person throughout the interview or throughout your relationship over time as well. Thinking if it's not just a one-off kind of situation. And you might get some more, and even if they didn't, answer it yes or no before, you might get some more insights to a previous conversation that you really didn't get to dig into too deeply ahead of time. And then lastly, many interviewers don't necessarily give interviewees time to think through answers and fully and kind of allow silence to happen. A lot of times when we're talking about facilitation, and you probably noticed it on these trainings, we're asked to wait almost about 7 seconds for responding, which can feel uncomfortable. It's something we're not necessarily used to as humans, to sit in silence. But a lot of times, especially for myself, I'm an introvert and I am thinking, I am processing, I am there, but it can take me a little bit of time to formulate really what I want to say, how I want to say it. So try and allow for that silence to happen, or that time where the gears are turning to happen, and leave room for those answers rather than quickly moving on and maybe skipping over something that you will have otherwise missed. And you also don't always have to say anything. If you get a short answer from someone, you can kind of allow them to sit with that for a moment too. I think we have a tendency to start to explain a little bit more of ourselves once we have the kind of space to do so. And you can also think about what might be prompts as someone's talking that would allow you to dig a little bit deeper into their story, that would allow them to share a little bit more of their truth. And that can hopefully create a more well-rounded story and a more complex character that we know everyone is, to what Scott was talking about earlier. Folks aren't one-dimensional. We're not necessarily a hero or a villain. There's so much to every character. And I think that allowing an interviewee to kind of unfold that themselves is a really important part of the kind of story gathering process. So we'll just go to the next slide where we have a couple of quick prompts before we get you all into breakout rooms. If you've joined us before, that's part of our process. So some things to just start you thinking about what some story ideas might be around the work that you're doing already. It might be something that you're thinking about doing in the future, or you're just starting to generate. So maybe you think about the people that are involved, who you're impacting, who your partners are, and who they're working with. It might also be the problems that you're looking to address. So the Colorado Equity Compass is focused a lot on social determinants of health, health equity, racism. So there are a lot of ideas there that you can start with, and things that we've probably started to generate in previous sessions as well. I mean, you'll see a prompt for this in the rooms as well, but who are those unheard voices? Whose stories have thus far maybe gone untold, or is missing, or maybe been quieted in the narrative? So thinking about those as a way to begin your story. And then also think about some success stories that you've heard. Think about the victories that have come up, or the accomplishments that have been shared within your community. I think we've talked a lot about how sometimes our brains can go to the negative, and yet I think there are a lot of successes that have happened too, whether within a community or within a maybe similar community outside of your own. There are lots of positives to kind of draw upon in order to start writing the story and start writing the narrative about what your work is doing, or what the work of others are doing, to address some of those, problem areas that we talked about. So that kind of leads us into our small group time, along with the document our journey section of the training today. So for folks who have joined us before and those who are returning all alike, I will put the link for this in the chat. This takes you to the document your data storytelling journey with the Colorado Equity Compass, and I'll walk through how you can use the slide for today. So for folks, Jesse, I think this is the first time you've probably seen this. So I will do a quick share of how to make a copy of this. Oh, my computer's not loading yet. So this is the Document Your Storytelling Journey with CEC tool. It's kind of been built upon each week as we go through these sessions, and particularly allow for time in the small groups to discuss some more about what's been going on in the training, and then start to build your own story. So for folks who are new, we'll go up here to File. You can make a copy of the entire presentation. And then you can choose where to save that, what you'd like to name it, etc. We do not have this enabled for you to make edits specifically, just so that other folks can continue to use it, and they don't necessarily have to go through your responses. For those who have joined us in the past and have your file already created and have kind of filled out some of these pages, you can go to the slide 8 on the link that was shared, and you can make a copy of it by right-clicking and click copy, or you can use your quick keys and make a copy and then paste it into your file, so that you can make edits in there. So these questions here, you'll kind of see our prompts that we're providing during the small group time. We have maybe slightly different wording within our slide deck. So Rochelle, I don't know if you want to share that. So these are some questions that we're providing for you for discussion within the next about 15 minutes time. So what are the important equity or ethical considerations for storytelling in your community? Another way to think about this is maybe what kind of stories have you seen in the past? Maybe what felt like, yes, this feels true to my community, what feels like it might be missing something or might be against something. What stories have you been, sorry, I just missed over that. And then also thinking about someone in your community. So sometimes it's easier, rather than talking about non-specifics, is sometimes thinking about the people themselves. So think about someone in your community, and how would you go about gathering their story? How would you go about introducing this process, or what you're using their story for? Where might you share it? How might you include them in kind of that editing review process, so that they continue to have ownership over their story? So just those are some prompts for you all in addition to the ones that we have in the document, my data story document as well. I can place those in the chat so they'll follow you into rooms.
Great. Well, welcome back. So what did you all talk about? Anything you want to share or reflections?
Zach was sharing a really cool project that they were working on for like talking to local community members and seeing the way that things have changed over time, gathering that first person history and it getting close to being a podcast. And hopefully there will be support in the future to make those final steps because it sounds amazing.
Ooh.
I feel like you sounded way more optimistic than I did. I think it was a super cool
Communications,
project.
man, I don't know.
Yeah, they did tons of interviews looking at kind of some displaced neighborhoods and different populations through Durango and La Plata County over the last 100 years or so.
Wow.
But yeah, just kind of, I'm trying to see what ideas I could help come up with. I was pretty inspired by the Chaffee County stuff 2 weeks ago. It was, yeah, similar kind of things, but we were looking, they had found funding in more of an arts and culture track, which dried up a bit. So yeah, trying to see how maybe we could find some funding and have some projects like that. Yeah, potentially not just as someone's side project podcast, but yeah, kind of getting some more weight behind it, hopefully. So we almost had a good little podcast storytelling thing going as well.
That's great, Zach. I think it's such a powerful way to share stories, and there's definitely more, feels like there's more interest in funding stories in some of the public sector as well as in private philanthropy. So I know that in the American Evaluation Association world, their next conference is focused, the theme is on the power of stories. And so I think there's just a lot of movement in this direction, which is great. Oh, cool. Anything else anyone would like to add? All right. Well, we'll go back to just talking a little bit about the structure of stories. And Maria, you were kind of alluding to this at the beginning of the call, but thinking about how a good story has good character and emotion, kind of thinking about how we engage, get people excited or interested in our stories, and spending some time to think about who's the character. The character doesn't need to be an individual. It could be a group or a school or a coalition. So having character, though, that is built around the main person or people is important, and some kind of emotion, because as we talked about earlier, that helps with engagement and memory of a particular story. So sometimes the character and the emotion comes out not necessarily by, sometimes not who you might have thought was the main character, but a side character or a side storyline. And so this is, we had conversations with Eve about, like, when you're interviewing people, do you already have the story in mind? Sometimes you do, but then sometimes that interview actually, the story emerges. And so having that flexibility is important. We also know that there's a good structure to a story. So usually you want to make sure you've got some kind of beginning that has the setup of the character or the setup of the current context. But that is established as part of the beginning of a story. And it might be that you're telling the story from the past, or it's kind of you're coming in currently, but you're starting it somewhere. And then in the middle, you're having some kind of something happen, right? Either it's a conflict or some kind of, sometimes it's talked about as an inciting incident. Something happens that makes change possible in some way, or a perspective change, or maybe it's some kind of game-changing moment that occurs. We do a lot of work in change management, so we often talk about how do you create an upset sometimes to the status quo, or maybe there is an unexpected turn of events, maybe funding is lost, or there's an infusion of funding. So there's some way in this middle part usually to bring some kind of immediacy into the story. And then there's an ending of some sort. And this is very simplistic. Sometimes we talk about a 5-beat story. So there's like other things that happen in here, but we just wanted to keep it simple. But then there's an end. So there's some kind of tension that happens and then it's resolved in some way. And so that can get to the emotional journey part of what we were talking about earlier, so that you're kind of thinking about how you're engaging the audience. But there's usually at the end some kind of shift of perspective, some kind of letting go of maybe a belief or a role, or there's a new approach that's happening. Essentially, there was some kind of action that happened. And you know, I just always have these conversations with my son, who gets so annoyed because he just feels like all movies have a happy ending. And so he doesn't like movies that have happy endings. He's always looking for that like unresolved ending or that negative ending to a story. But I'm one of the, I like happy ending movies. So we have that constant, that debate over what makes a good story or a good movie. So unresolved endings, yeah, Jesse, I need those. He's now 18, so he's my adult son now at this point. So in the next slide, again, we just kind of offer that example of the structure. So I always go back to Star Wars. Boy, that movie really made an impact on me. But, you know, you're talking about a time when, or, you know, long time ago, or at the beginning of the pandemic, or after the pandemic, where we are now, you know, setting it in a certain place, either in a galaxy far away, or maybe closer, like in Durango, or at the community center, or somewhere, something happens. And this is kind of where you can leverage that imagery piece too. And we'll talk about that more next time. And that just starts to engage you. So we wanted to do a little practicing in the few minutes that we have left here, if you'd like to indulge us in this. We thought maybe we would get some stories from you during the community builder. Of course, you could use Star Wars, but we're wanting to just take a little time to just practice, so that we have kind of a sense of, as you're looking at a good story or something that's been memorable, where do you see those components coming through? And so just as a way for you to think about an existing story, but then translate that later maybe into a story that you might be working on, or a blog, you know, the stories in the blogs that are going in, to ensure that they have that kind of good structure that is shown to be effective. And boy, thanks for these suggestions here. I will need to go to those and offer those to Jeremy. So can anyone guess which story we're asking you to look at from the slide? Ooh, we were too subtle. Maria?
The Three Little Pigs.
Yeah. All right. So as you're thinking, does everyone know the story behind the Three Little Pigs? Okay. As you're thinking about the Three Little Pigs, want to encourage, just think about what was the setup, what was the beginning of the story, what was kind of the middle that was going on, and what was the ending that happened. So if you want to just throw your thoughts, you could put beginning and then type in a little bit, and then middle on your responses in the Menti, and just put that in, and let's see what kind of story we end up with here.
I'm also sitting here like, let me double check that I'm thinking of the right nursery story.
I know, we were like trying to think what would be a common enough story. And I
Good
don't know
news.
if,
I was thinking of the right one.
yeah, sometimes they've done revisions on these, on, the childhood stories too, so.
Maria's
If
got it
you
right in
want.
front of her.
You do,
I could host story hour for you.
Love it.
Oh my gosh, that's great.
I kind of forgot the part where they boiled and ate the wolf at the end.
Oh.
I'm gonna call that an error.
I feel like I've seen that, like, yeah, across my entire life. There's been like, oh yeah, and also in this version, there's an extra 3 pages where they boil and eat the wolf, basically.
That's so
Kind
I'm
of
funny.
just
like
gonna
when you're a
copy and
kid.
paste it in the chat for fun.
Oh, there you go, Jesse. Yeah, I feel like I am visualizing a version where I saw the wolf sitting at the top of a cliff, looking down at the houses and like having a boiling pot of water and being sad. Like, I'm not even sure where that image came from, but that's a memory I have, a visualization. All right, so we've got the brothers build houses out of different materials, and each for different reasons, right? Whether it was ease or solidness or laziness. And then we've got this middle part, the wolf coming in and knocking on the doors and wanting in to gather the pigs. And the end with the 2 pigs scrambling as their houses fall down and go and live in one. What's this last part? Oh, they encounter the bell person. Yes. And I like that, and we've got this response here: cause and effect of the pig's preparations versus the results, a consistent threat from a wolf, and the differences in how each pig prepares. Yeah. So thanks. It's kind of fun to go back to some of these childhood stories. It's also scary sometimes when you look at some of the biases they had and the trauma and the traumatic stories that were sometimes there that, I don't know, we just missed them as kids, or I don't know what was going on with some of these childhood stories. But anyway, thank you for engaging in that process with us. It's good to kind of reflect though, and you can kind of see that as you look at stories and you see what stories kind of stick and what the pattern is that you can see that emerges as you learn and kind of break apart stories and look at them, and to find where the tension is, what, here the cause and the effect, the consistent threat, as all part of an element of a good story. So we'll be excited to hear what kind of stories are emerging in your communities. And when we come back next time, we want to really think of a little bit more then about how to bring that visualization aspect into your stories now, as we think of all the 3 components: the data, the narrative, and then the visualization that help to come together to make an effective story. So thanks for joining us today. It was fun. We invite you to continue to engage with us on the website and on our social media. We're also going to be presenting at the Culture of Data in April. And we're also hoping to just continue to let people know about the CEC. So please share our information with your colleagues in your network. Alina, anything else you want to share?
I don't think so. Just thank you all for joining us. And it looked like, Jesse, you had your hand up.
Oh,
I think this slide answered it actually, because I was like, and where can we find the recording? So
yeah. So all the recordings for the series are up on our website. We also send a follow-up email to participants so that you'll get a direct link to that as well. And if there's anything, Go ahead.
Because I'd love to be able to refer back to the recorded material and structuring a teach back. So
Yeah. Thank you. And if you have any feedback for this session, feel free to let us know on the Menti. That next slide is up, and we welcome any thoughts or ideas. And especially as we're coming back to the coming up on the last session in a couple of weeks too. So thank you for joining us, and we hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone.